Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the 17th meeting of the Welfare Reform Committee for 2013. Could I start by asking everyone to switch off their mobile phones and electronic devices? And that brings us to agenda item 1. It's on the bedroom tax in Scotland. The committee commissioned a report on the impact of the bedroom tax in Scotland, and that research was published on the 19th of October. I'd like to invite Professor Gibb to make an opening statement, and I'll then invite questions from members. Professor Gibb, over to you.
Thanks very much, Convener, and thanks for the opportunity to make these introductory remarks. I was given this brief in the summer of 2013 to find out what we know so far about the impact of the under-occupation charge on working-age social tenants that was introduced in April 2013, and implicitly what we don't know about those impacts. I reviewed the academic policy and practice literature. I endeavoured to collect data from different sources that were available, and with the agreement of the clerk and the convener, I also interviewed a small sample of social landlords from different settings across Scotland. I then tried to pull this together and draw a few conclusions and recommendations. So I don't want to repeat what's in the report, but I will say a little bit about the principal findings that came out of this. First of all, at May 2013, the charge affected something of the order of 82,500 tenants, costing an average of £50 a month. 4 in 5 of those households appear to include a disabled adult, and 15,500 consisted of families with dependent children. However, and a point I kind of repeatedly stress in the report is that these figures are constantly changing. There's an inherent dynamic to them, so we need to be cautious about the overall numbers that we're talking about. And secondly, while numbers have been quoted and are mentioned in the report about arrears and the level of arrears, this is also dynamic. It's also subject to change, not least because of the changing number of cases facing the charge, but also because of the snapshot nature of the data that it's captured from, and also, of course, still to come, to some extent, the impact of discretionary housing payments, which will reduce those arrears. Thirdly, it's inherently difficult to pin down precisely the number of people who are seeking to downsize to avoid the charge in smaller homes. Or indeed, is it easy or simple or straightforward to estimate the number of smaller property size vacancies that actually come on the market, as it were? Moreover, many of these properties have other demands for them, statutory homeless, medical needs and other things like that. So it's very difficult to calculate either the numerator, the households wanting to downsize, or the denominator, the flow of vacancies coming into the system. Fourthly, the evidence both from the literature and from landlords, although it's qualitative evidence, suggests that many under-occupiers do not actually want to move. And the combination of family, friends, support networks and the lack of alternative housing solutions is makes them want to stay in their current home. Fifth, landlords also stress the wide variety of experiences, contexts and differing capacity to absorb the impacts of the charge, particularly when you look across differences to do with urban and rural housing systems, high demand and low demand labour markets, and the council housing sector and the housing association sector. Landlords told me that single people and those with illnesses are principally exposed to the financial hardship, and that discretionary housing payment mitigation is going to be essential for those kinds of people. Sixthly, landlords also expressed concerns about the future, particularly about the end of direct payments, the changes to DLA, and the end of local housing benefit administered by councils, because there would be an end to that financial information relationship between councils and recipients of benefit. They also therefore stressed the importance of investment in money advice, in budgetary skills and financial inclusion more generally. There's a number of recommendations in the report that flow from these sort of findings about the importance of the continuity of discretionary housing payments, about the importance of improving the quantity and quality of data collection so that we can match together the vacancies of properties by size against the kinds of households who would need to downsize. We need more work to be done in that area, and I know that the parts of the government are looking at that. Thirdly, there clearly needs to be significant investment or a greater level of commitment to investment in money advice and financial inclusion training and budgetary skills. And finally, given the broader sort of political context, I think it seems to me, looking at the evidence, that there needs to be some caution if one was to consider, and certainly there should be further consultation about considering either blanket forgiveness of arrears or to sort of rule out completely evictions in this case, and I'm sure we'll talk about that some more. So I want to stress finally that the introduction of this regime, the under-occupation regime, has been difficult to track. It's been hard to monitor and assess because we've been relying on different snapshots of information, FOI requests, sample surveys, regionally based studies, all at a point in time. And I think while we can say things quite reasonably about the body of this evidence as a whole, we should be clear that on the one hand it's interim evidence, it's still early days, and secondly we know much less about the behaviour of people, how they respond as individuals, and that's precisely why I think that qualitative evidence was quite useful actually. And the final point I guess to make is that this is a very, very live issue, and one only has to look at the period of time since this report was sent to you in October, the number of studies, a number of other things that have happened since then. We've had a study from the University of York, which has tested the DWP's assumptions about the savings that can be made from the under-occupation charge. We've had the housing regulators' arrears study. We've had a study by the Grand Union Housing Group. We've had a report on arrears by North Lanarkshire Council. We've had arrears research by the BBC, which was published yesterday, and many other news stories and items relevant to this. So this all goes to show the currency and the saliency of the issue, but it also marks up, I think, the sort of genuine difficulty of having an accurate picture in such a rapidly moving scene.
Yeah, thanks very much, Professor Gibb. I found the information in your report very enlightening and challenging. It shows that we do have a lot of work to do in order to get a proper understanding, a complete understanding, if you like, of where things are at the moment and where they're likely to go. But I just wonder, I'll start off before coming to other colleagues by asking a question which you may not be able to answer. It's a question about the correlation between each local authority's allocation of discretionary housing payment and the likely demand in that area. Did you, for example, North Lanarkshire, local authority in the area I represent, has maximised the amount that it can put forward for discretionary housing payment, but not all local authorities have done so. Is there a correlation between the demand in that area, given that North Lanarkshire is the biggest social landlord in Scotland? It's probably likely that they would need to maximise the DHP. But are other areas where there's less demand, is that the reason why they haven't maximised the DHP availability?
The landlords that I spoke to, I only spoke to 3 council landlords in any detail. They were all trying to make the maximum use of the DHP, and they focused more on the problems, I think, of engaging with hard-to-reach tenants and that sort of an issue. You would imagine that North Lanarkshire, because of its size, would make the kind of efforts that it appears to have done, but certainly one of the other councils I spoke to was a smaller council, and they were making exactly the same level, seems to me at least, they were making the same levels of commitment to use the DHP as effectively as they could, but they were on a much smaller scale because they saw it as a way of significantly tackling a problem so they could manage the rest of the problem as well as they could. So I guess it's how councils view the strategies that they take, and also all the mitigation work that they've done beforehand, meeting with individual tenants, identifying the people most at risk, etc. It's how effective they've been at that would probably shape to some extent how they want to use that resource. And also, I guess, I mean, the problem that I always have with all of this is what else would the DHP be used for? And one of the issues that I've been struck by is the problems that that face private renting tenants, who are also in many cases face a lot of financial problems, but we're so focused on the under-occupation charge that maybe there's other groups of people who are losing out on all of this.
Again, you may not have had the time or the capacity to get into all of this, but is there any indication of a sort of can't pay but wouldn't pay whether they could or not, sort of campaign runner. I know it's not like the poll tax where people chose not to pay even though they could afford to do so. In some instances, there are people who they know they're subjected to the bedroom tax, but are not engaging with the local authority because, regardless of the circumstances, they just are not prepared to accept that they need help or that they actually want to have the help.
That seemed to be the tenor of the BBC, part of the BBC piece that was out yesterday. It's certainly possible, and I think if council officers are experiencing that, and they're not. I mean, what I don't know is whether they're inferring that or whether they actually know it for a fact. Certainly, again, the landlords I spoke to, there weren't really any instances of that, but the instance of what there was where people were appealing against the charge, and I think in at least one case a landlord was giving them some help, but I don't recall any kind of flags rising that there was a sense that people were actively enacting civil disobedience or anything like that.
I'll open up. I'll go to Alex first.
Thank you very much. I'm going to cover a bit of the same ground, and it's something that Professor Gibb covered in his opening statement. And again, I'm going to do the same thing without giving too much credit to the BBC. I'm going to reflect on some of the things the BBC said yesterday. Now, they highlighted a number of local authorities that have run up substantial levels of arrears. But also, to give the story some balance, they mentioned some local authorities that appear to be doing rather well in this area. I've been interested for some time in the geographical differences that exist between local authorities in some areas as opposed to others, and I think they're becoming more plain, more easy to see. But I'm concerned about why these differences exist, and I wanted to ask you some questions in relation to that. For a start, there is a substantial level of funding that's now been made available through discretionary funds, and that, in theory at least, should be made available across Scotland on the basis of need. Is there some failing in our understanding of that need that causes that resource to be inappropriately distributed?
That's a very interesting question. I mean, I think it's always challenging to answer the question of whether needs and the need for resource is allocated in exactly the way that we might objectively measure need. I would guess that's something we could always debate. I am clear that I think the really significant point at this stage is that it's still really early to know whether the discretionary housing payments are being used as effectively, as optimally as the allocation would suggest. What people said to me in these landlords that I spoke to was that they were working their way through the process of getting people to sign up for DHP and making sure that the people that they prioritised as the people most urgently requiring these things were getting it, and they were working through that process. Now, what wasn't clear is whether in a rural area with a relatively small catchment area that you can do that relatively quickly, or whether in some larger urban areas you need a much bigger investment. Perhaps what North Lanarkshire has done is put a major investment into that. I guess that's an unfolding issue. Like many of these things, it's an unfolding thing that will become clear as we go through the financial year.
So, we simply have to wait and see.
I think so. Just to finish, I mean, I think that's partly because of the discretionary nature and the relative autonomy that local governments seem to have in this matter. They are pursuing their priorities and their strategies, and as I think people like Shelter have said, there is a question about how one would monitor and evaluate and assess local authority performance and the standards and the kind of ways that they're operating. At the moment, it seems they have quite a lot of autonomy, and we obviously are very concerned about this, but we'll just have to, at this point, we seem to have to wait to see.
You mentioned North Lanarkshire, and I suppose at this time we should apologise to North Lanarkshire for the fact that I'm going to talk about them as well. I'm keen to emphasise that I don't wish to criticise North Lanarkshire, but they information that became available in relation to North Lanarkshire, I believe, informs this debate to some extent. So the principles at play there, I think, are worthy of discussion. North Lanarkshire came out early and said that there would be no evictions as a result of the bedroom tax, and then subsequently announced substantial levels of non-payment of under occupancy charge and growing problems with non-payment of rent or rent arrears across the board. Do you think the two things were related?
They may well be, though I think there's evidence in other councils where that's not necessarily the case. And I think, is it not also the case in Stirling, for instance? I think they've made a similar kind of commitment. I might be wrong, but I think that's the case. And I'm not sure that they've had a significant increase in arrears. I mean, as I said in the report, I do have some concerns about, simply saying, in a sense, there is a class of arrears here that doesn't matter as much as other arrears, and I worry about that in the longer term, particularly with the rollout of universal credit and the end of direct payments. I think we should be a wee bit cautious and think about the implications of that. That there may be dangers for in saying to some very vulnerable people that there are some classes of arrears which aren't as important as others. I think it's obviously a political choice ultimately, but it's something that we should reflect on. Yeah.
Finally, and relating to the North Lanarkshire experience again, there seemed to me, from the information that was made available, that there was a fairly quick rise in arrears in North Lanarkshire, but a relatively low take-up in the resources that were available, discretionary housing payments and other sources, to alleviate that problem. Do you think I'm choosing words very carefully here, and I don't want to give the wrong impression, but if I use the word political, please try to understand it in a broader sense. Do you think the political environment that existed in North Lanarkshire Council in the earlier part of this year had some influence on the fact that more people chose to go into arrears rather than seek the assistance that was available?
Although I'm a North Lanarkshire resident, I don't know if I know enough about the ins and outs of the political environment in North Lanarkshire. As I said before, I would have been cautious about moving to the kind of commitments that have been made for the reasons I've suggested. I also think it's again important in relation to the other people, not just working age social tenants who may be having problems in the current welfare reform environment. So I don't think I'd say any more than that, because I don't think I know enough about the political environment.
Thank you.
Come to Jamie, we just point out that North Lanarkshire must be confused this morning, since we've got the First Minister accusing them of being the first local authority to try and evict someone, and Alex Johnson telling us that because they won't evict someone that they're actually causing the arrears to increase. So I'm sure they must be as confused as I am. Jamie?
Yes, and as a North Lanarkshire MSP as well, Convener, I have to say I have my own perspective as to how early they announced their no evictions policy. But that said, I want to turn to the table 4.5 in your paper, Professor Gibb clearing the backlog of under-occupants. I presume we're using the terminology of the UK Government as to what an under-occupant might be. I thought it was very interesting to see that there was an estimation that it could take about just over 3 years to rehouse those affected by the under-occupation penalty, the bedroom tax, when you take into account how many one-bedroom lets are available in North Lanarkshire. As I say, the area where my constituency is, it's estimated to be 5.27 years. I mean, these are clearly a long period of time for people to be waiting to be rehoused. Can you talk us through the methodology involved in coming to these figures?
I mean, I'd like to start by saying actually that those figures, I think, are representative of a fair effort to try and understand what's going on, done by colleagues in SPICE. However, I think I'm not really satisfied with any single effort to try to understand what this downsizing proportion or the backlog period actually is. What's good about table 4.5 in the SPICE methodology there is it's an attempt to understand the allocation of households to different housing property sizes, and then to relate that to the kinds of vacancies coming forward. But it's incredibly difficult to do. And that's from quite old data, from 2009-10, some of that data. So there's a lot of things going on in there. So I certainly wouldn't want to go to the stake on it. I think I've said elsewhere in the report that there's a much broader band of this backlog period, which could be as much as 10 years in some circumstances. It's really difficult to work out. It's also what you might call an upper bound estimate. We're making no assumptions about behaviour here, about this very striking fact in the quality of evidence, and also in some other of the literature, that folk often have got really strong pull reasons not to move. And so you can have an upper bound and say, well, potentially, there's a kind of potential level of turnover of smaller properties which will achieve this outcome. But the reality is probably very different. And it's again, I sound like a cracked record, but it's something that we actually need to have really good evidence on vacancies and the shape of the vacancies and the shape of the kind of households moving. And another area that's not really touched on is what you might call a kind of chain of moves that follow on. As somebody frees up a 2-bedroom property, somebody in a 3-bedroom property could move into that, etc. So there's all that going on. There's also a whole bunch of the older under-occupiers, the people who are not of working age, who many studies suggest are a much bigger proportion of people than are people of working age. So there's how they get accommodated and how much under-occupation is left amongst the people who are longer term sort of housing. So my general point, rather than being specific about the methodology, is to say that it's really quite difficult to get to this. I mean, the Institute of Housing and DWP talked about an aggregate 4 to 5 years to clear that backlog. But some of the other studies by the Scottish Federation of Housing Associations using a sample have suggested quite a bit more. And I think even looking at a very crude level at the score data of new lets and the breakdown of new lets suggests, given that there's a good proportion of people who would have probably prior call to 1-bedroom properties, like the homeless, like people with some medical needs who maybe need to be in a ground floor flat, that further reduces the volume of those 1-bedroom vacancies and would extend the period that downsizing would take.
Actually, what you're saying to us is that this estimate of 3 years to rehouse those affected could be quite a conservative estimate. I mean that would suggest then that the suggestion from the UK government, the assumption that people, if they're affected, they just go ahead and rehouse themselves, is quite a blithe assumption. Then
Maybe we wouldn't use that language, but I think it is a strong assumption. It's a kind of aggregate assumption that doesn't really break the thing down. I don't think.
You mentioned the issue of the pull factor being stronger for people to stay in their home than the push factor, the bedroom tax being the push factor. And I thought that was a really interesting point, and you touched on it there and you touched on it in your opening. Mark, I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about that, how you've come to that assessment, how you've come to that position, and what are the pull factors?
Well, I think there's a number of things that are going on. One is that people have, particularly outside of cities, I think actually, but in towns and in more rural housing communities, it seems to be the case that people have developed their own support networks, their friends and family. They have kind of social capital bound up in where they are. It's where they're used to being. They've also been on a kind of housing journey over their lives, whatever generation they're of, where they're expecting to kind of move in a at least not to go backwards, as it were, in terms of the quality of housing they consume. And of course, they've over a period of time they've had housing allocated to them of a certain kind, which may be with an extra bedroom. So they've established a home on that basis. And then when they're confronted with the alternative of downsizing, you might be in a rural community where actually there simply aren't any 1-bedroom properties at all, or they are in a different community altogether. So you'd be going from one part of the Highlands to the other, or from one island to another, or something like that. And that's quite a different question from moving from one part of the city of Glasgow to another. Even that's a big challenge for many people, but that's a much smaller challenge than those kinds of challenges. So that was something which became apparent talking to some of the landlords in some rural areas, but it was also something that came through in the more kind of urban ones as well, that people had built up this sense of community and they wanted to protect it. And actually going back to the rural landlords, some of them made the point that this kind of process of fracturing the existing community, given some rural communities are obviously very fragile and are small, you know, this puts risks into that. But so it's those kinds of sets of issues that people were, that landlords were relaying to me, and I think you do find in some of the literature too. So, and it kind of, you know, it's when I started thinking about this work, I was certainly of the mind that there would be some degree of difficulty in downsizing. There would be some resistance to it, in large part because the way social housing has been allocated for the last 20 or 30 years, as in the name of progress, in a sense, we've got rid of small properties, just as a class of properties, almost to simplify it. That puts those people in a very different situation. There's a lack of an obvious housing solution for them unless they're willing to seriously downsize or change tenure, and a lot of people are. Again, we assume there's a kind of always going to be a private rented sector out there. There may not be.
I mean, suppose you said yourself that, you know, these people have established a home. So is that not? It's not just a house. It's not just bricks and mortar. It's not a commodity. You know, UK government may just think this is a commodity that they can shove people in, but to these people, it's their home.
Yes, it's a home, and there's a neighbourhood, and there's all those other attributes that go with that. Yes.
Thank you very much.
Okay, Wanda.
All right. Thank you. Some of which I wanted to ask you about, Professor, has been covered, but there's a couple of other things from a sort of practitioner point of view, I guess. In paragraph 85, I was quite intrigued by your final sentence. You know, you talk about the irony that much of the learning that will be delivered as a result of implementing and dealing with the consequences of the bedroom tax will in part be lost by the nature of succeeding welfare benefit reforms. Just wondered if you could expand on that a bit.
Absolutely.
Please.
Well, this really relates, I think, to this idea that on a statutory basis, because they're administering housing benefit, local authorities are dealing directly with tenants, and they have built up a relationship with benefit eligible tenants. They have a direct entree to talk to them about budgeting and financial issues and those kind of things. And clearly, as part of a mitigation strategy going back more than probably 18 months, many social landlords, council and association alike, have been working really hard and building up knowledge about their current body of tenants and good practice. And it's clear from the Institute of Housing and the SFHA and others that there's a lot of good practice being shared about management of arrears in this sort of situation. But the point, I guess, is that all of that expertise will become redundant quite quickly once we move to the universal credit system, and those landlords are no longer directly in a relationship with tenants. And moreover, they're going to have to build a new relationship with them, and they're going to have to keep doing that. And that, I guess, that's a completely different kind of customer relationship to what they've been used to in the past. And it's a customer relationship, but a different. It's not like you were buying and selling commodities. The landlords are actually trying to help people make better financial decisions, obviously so they pay their rent, etc., but so that they budget more effectively. So I think it's ironic that in a determination to try to improve people's sort of welfare, which is after all what these things are supposedly trying to do, and the universal credit's trying to do, and there's elements of merit about it clearly, that one of the important sources of information and knowledge that actually oil the system is going to be lost.
Yes, yeah, thanks for that. Which I guess takes me back to a discussion that we touched on earlier, which is about paragraph 75 in your report, where you're saying it's not always possible to identify accurately arrears from the bedroom tax as opposed to other pre-existing or otherwise new arrears. I'd be interested in you talking a wee bit more about what you then say in this paragraph about just the sheer impossibility for some practitioners to be able to identify that, especially if it's a large landlord.
I think there's a lot of the work about arrears seems to me to be based on some assumptions. It basically says if people weren't on arrears the day before the financial year started but have moved into arrears, and those arrears equate to what their rent loss would be from house movement, then it's straightforward that that's related to the under-occupation charge. That will probably be true in 90-odd% of the case, but it won't be always true anyway, but it'll be almost always true. The problem is what happens to those people who are already in arrears, who then added to the arrears because of the charge. Also, the fact that some people will move in and out of arrears. There are technical arrears. Some people will be in arrears very briefly, then they'll move out of it. There are lots of intervening variables. It's clear that some landlords I spoke to found it relatively straightforward to work it out because they had a small base of tenants to work with, a small base of clients who this applied to, and you could work it out. But the bigger your housing stock, the more variety there are in rents and circumstances, the more volatile, the more churn that there is, the harder that's going to be. And I think if you're a sheriff and you're confronted with a case of arrears, it's going to be sometimes not always straightforward to tell what are the under-occupation arrears and what are the other arrears.
So that I hadn't thought of it from the sheriff's point of view, but then you're saying as it goes all the way through the system, from the person who is charged with arrears management having to make that decision, and then further down the line when it actually gets to court.
It's also worth saying, I think, that, as I said in an earlier response, that the one of the most striking things in the last couple of years has been the sort of level of proactive arrears management the landlords are taking on. They've obviously learnt an awful lot. They're doing a lot of good things, and that actually, to be positive about it, that may be part of the reason why the discretionary housing payments thing is working through the way it is, because other solutions are being found, mutual exchanges and things of that kind are being found that are other ways of resolving the problem.
And I just wondered too if that conclusion that you reached informed the actual recommendation. It was one of the recommendations, but I'll quote it from the executive summary. Number 5, you're saying that caution should be exercised before considering blanket forgiveness of such arrears. Was that statement informed by what you learned about arrears management?
It is, because I think there's a technical issue there about what the arrears actually are, and the way that they change over time, and what somebody's previous arrears were, and how their behaviour was influenced by the fact they were already in arrears, for instance, and also the way in which their landlord is working with them to try to reduce those arrears. But it's also about that worry, I think, as I said earlier, that if you make that kind of commitment, then I think there's a longer term worry about the behaviour in the context of the end of direct payments and those kinds. It seems to be you're making things more difficult for yourself. I also think, though, that again, to be positive about it, I think landlords work very hard on a case-by-case basis to understand the nature of some of these financial problems, and they do everything they can to resolve it in most cases I'm aware of. And that seems to me, that more tailored, customised, hands-on approach seems to me better than having a simple across-the-board rule.
Yeah, thank you.
Kevin. Thank you, Convener. And I'd like to go back to some of the points that Jamie raised. Professor Gibb, I think one of the most interesting things for me is round about the number of one-bedroom lets that are available across the country. And you said yourself that vacancies in the market were a little bit sporadic, I think. In terms of those one-bedroom properties that are available, have you any idea, or have you been given any idea, of how many of those one-bedroom properties are either amenity or sheltered accommodation rather than mainstream accommodation?
Right, the numbers that I looked at were in relation to the housing association sector and in the SCORE data, which is reported in Chapter 4. And I think that the great majority of them, I think almost all of them are general needs housing, so we're not talking about special lets of some kind or another. That doesn't mean, though, that, for instance, some of those lets would be, because, as I said earlier, because they're a ground floor, for instance, that would be something that an elderly resident with mobility issues would have a priority for. So it doesn't change the fact that you might have a given number of one-bedroom vacancies, but actually they're not, a large proportion of them, maybe half of them, aren't actually available for for downsizing purposes because we have other commitments. If you were to compare England with Scotland, for instance, in England you wouldn't have the same statutory homeless requirement to house people. So in England they probably could focus on the downsizing issue in a way that we wouldn't in Scotland, because we would be seeking to house statutorily homeless people.
Would it be fair to say that in terms of local authority housing, that a large amount of the single bedroom properties that they have on their books is set aside for amenity or sheltered purposes?
I'm not absolutely sure, to be honest. I thought you were going to say something else there. I thought you were going to say that they'd be set aside for homelessness, which I think they probably would be. I dare say, I think it depends at a local level on levels of needs and the kinds of provision that they've got. I'd also say, though, that housing associations have nomination agreements. So often, you know, half of all the properties that become vacant will have to go to what the local authority puts through, which would be, again, homeless people.
Convener, I want to touch upon some of the past housing policy that there has been in Scotland, which I don't think has been taken into account either. First of all, I'd like to give an example in terms of in Aberdeen, at one point where there were a large amount of voids in certain areas, we had housing initiative areas designated, and people were given houses which were bigger than their requirements, but just to ensure that those properties were filled. In terms of housing strategy plans right across the country, one-bedroom properties didn't feature very highly for a long time. And of course, we've had the policy in many areas which I think lots and lots of people supported, was Homes for Life initiative, so that homes were adaptable as things happened to families and to individuals. I wonder, in terms of your research, if these issues have come up, and if folks have said that, you know, this has been a complete volte-face in terms of housing policy here in Scotland, and what they had to say about that volte-face.
No, that's exactly right. I mean, I think that's the context that this takes place in, and that's the starting point that many of the housing professionals would go from. That for several decades, that there's been this direction to grow the average size of a social housing unit in general needs terms, and there's been a reduction in the supply of one-bedroom units. So you now have a situation where social landlords across the country in several places are buying up off-the-shelf one-bedroom properties because they don't have any, or don't have anything like enough. So they are, and they're reflecting, as you said, a succession of policies which have kind of moved us away from the notion of that spread of properties. We still often hear, though, people saying, well, there aren't nearly enough larger properties. So there's a much bigger mismatch between property and households and people's aspirations, and also up until April, the aspirations that governments seem to have shared for a long period of time, that the properties were going to be bigger.
In terms of what you've just said of local authorities going out and trying to buy one-bedroom properties on the hoof, if you like, do you think that in itself, responding to crisis, is a good way of dealing with housing policy? And has the fact that the Westminster government, the fact that they've sprung the bedroom tax on people as they have, with very, very quick implementation, caused some chaos in terms of housing provision in Scotland?
Well, people had a couple of years, I guess, to get their heads around it going to happen. I don't think it's necessarily bad policy to try and do that, to try and buy properties off the shelf. It's quicker and cheaper, and it's a quicker response than trying to build one-bedroom properties, which will take probably 3 or 4 times the time to do that. So, in that sense, it's quite if you've got the resource and it seems to be a good use of scarce resources, then it's maybe not such a crazy thing to do. So, I think you need to look at each case on its merits, really, I think.
Okay, I can understand where you're coming from there, but at the same time, you said that there's a shortage of larger properties, which I'm sure that colleagues around the table will have experienced. Do you think it's the case that this rush to get new one-bedroom properties means that there will be less chance of more large properties coming into the system, which means that overcrowding continues in a number of areas?
Well, that's a corollary of that. That's right. I mean, if resources are diverted into smaller properties, they're not going into building bigger units. But I think it's generally this is quite a difficult area, because I think in the same way that I've been sort of banging on about the lack of clarity of information about vacancies and about one-bedroom units, there's also a lack of, I think, reliable information about overcrowding as well, which is the other side of the coin. If there's a housing reason for doing this, it's because there's overcrowding in parts of the system. I think there's evidently overcrowding in some pressured markets. There's no escaping that, and there'll be pockets of other areas where there are. But what little evidence there is suggests that, for instance, there's a study in Merseyside, I think, which suggests that actually under-occupation is a much bigger problem than overcrowding is. You can have the two things alongside each other quite easily. You know, following your line about the HIAs, if you over time put single people into bigger properties because they're void, you will have a kind of under-occupation in that sense. But it doesn't mean that somewhere else there will necessarily be overcrowding. There might not be. So it's one of those things which needs to be addressed at a local level by doing needs analysis and doing a housing strategy and working out resources alongside it. But it doesn't follow that you should have a national under-occupation charge, because there's not necessarily a national overcrowding problem.
That's why we had local housing strategies to try and resolve all of these problems, yes. Most of which have, a hole has been blown under the waterline with the under-occupancy charge, as they would call it, the bedroom tax, as I would call it. Would that be fair to say?
Well, I think that's an interpretation of it. I don't think strategies have been blown out of the water. I mean, they're still extremely valuable. They face a new challenge, certainly.
Thank you, Convener.
Ken.
Thank you, Convener. And thank you, Professor Gibb, for the report. Before turning to the impact, which is clearly our main focus, the drivers for the policy itself have been to try to make work pay, to reduce dependence on benefits, and also to save money. Did you look at the success, as it were, of the policy in achieving any or all of these aims?
Well, as all my previous answers say, I'd say it's still very early days to answer those kind of questions. But what I would say is that certainly landlords did say that there were instances of people getting work coming off benefit. Now, again, who's to say those people would have come off benefit in any case? That they were going through a cycle of in benefit, in work, out work, etc., and that they came off it. But certainly, some people had come off benefit, had gone to work, and in that sense resolved the under-occupation problem in a way that government would have perceived as being a success. Some people have moved into have downsized, but actually one of the interesting things that comes out of some of the research that's emerged since this report is that it doesn't necessarily follow that government makes all the savings that it does when people downsize, because it depends how widely varying rents are. If rents are relatively flat, as they often are in Scotland, a smaller property can be a reduction in rent which is less than the reduction in the under-occupation charge. So you could find yourself making a saving, but not by as much as the charge. So they don't necessarily make the full level of savings. So there's an empirical question as to how much rents actually vary between those critical 2- and 1-bedroom units. It's often not by very much.
No, I'm interested you say that clearly it's a very mixed picture. It's very difficult to draw any firm conclusions. It's so varied. But it would certainly appear that your conclusions about the pull and push factors on people, that actually it's not really having certainly as much of a desired effect or impact as the government might have wished. And like you, I think it's also less clear, certainly to me or to anybody, that it's saving the sums of money that perhaps were originally intended. But at this stage, it's difficult. From what you're saying, it seems to be difficult to draw firm conclusions about those factors either.
Yeah, I would also say, though, that there's an opportunity cost here that's not necessarily measured, which is I mean, again, all the landlords and many of the surveys that Institute of Housing and others have done suggest that there's been a really big increase in the management costs that landlords have, and other providers, people involved, citizens' advice and such like, are involved in responding to this. So that is an opportunity cost that people are paying, be it tenants paying it through their rents, be it through public subsidy, be it through the money that third sector organisations have. So there is a cost there which really should be accounted for as part of netted off against the savings.
And of course there may be other costs associated with the particularly vulnerable group that are being targeted here. Is there a time? Is there a point at which you think either the UK or Scottish governments will be able to conclude or at least indicate the success of this policy in terms of its original intentions from a UK government perspective?
That's a good question. I mean, in a sense, you need 12 months because you need to get that. You need to get that run of vacancies. You need to get the run of people's changing decisions to change their housing. But on the other hand, I think we in order to work out whether it's succeeded, we need to understand the behaviour of the people affected, more so than anything else. It's whether they've made the kinds of choices that government, DWP, would have hoped that they would make, be they positive changes in the labour market or in terms of saving money on rent, as opposed to them deciding that the cost is worth bearing because they want to stay where they are. We'd have to take some views about that. I mean, I would say very strongly that my sort of conclusion about this work in many ways is that these behavioural issues that we really don't understand, and that they're the most important thing. And I would not want to stand on the views of 7 landlords, however representative they are, and their views about what's going on. I think it's indicative, and it suggests questions for, that we need to look at more. But going back to your question, it's certainly a year's worth of information you need. My slight caveat on that is the future of discretionary housing payments. We kind of know that they're going to be substantial in year 2 as well as year 1. The issue is how much of the under-occupiers have been taken out of the system by solutions relative to those people who are relying on the DHP.
And yeah, I mean, there seem to be 2 sets of behaviours. There's the response of the individuals concerned. There's also the behaviour of the local authorities and the Scottish Government, for that matter, in the sense that, from what you're saying, local authorities and housing providers have responded in quite different ways. Some have put more effort into seeking alternative accommodation. Most, wisely, I think, and sensibly, have focused their efforts on trying to alleviate the impact on individuals, which creates a very difficult situation. But it's trying to work out, at what point these might come together. Just on that, on the response of housing providers and local authorities and others on the issue of eviction and arrears, from what you're saying, there seems to be quite a variation across Scotland about the policies being pursued in this area. Is that right? Or is there actually a remarkable consistency? I mean, do they all have very similar policies when it comes to trying to identify and help people with arrears, trying to work out which ones are linked to the bedroom tax and so on?
That's the espoused position. That's what people are saying they're doing. And I think there's certainly there's a lot of networking going on. There's a lot of professional training working. A lot of people learning from practice, and everyone's speaking the same language. What one can't say then is that on the ground that leads to certain things going on. You'd have to kind of evidence that, I guess, to be able to say that. But that's certainly what people are saying, and it does seem to be a considerable additional effort that's been made, and people are saying the same kinds of things. They're doing the same kinds of things to try to ameliorate the kinds of problems that their tenants or clients are facing.
Is there any evidence that they've arrived at optimal solutions, though?
That's quite hard. No, I would say no. I think there are certain circumstances where people are able to achieve more, but that's because of the context they find themselves in. So that's not an optimal solution. That's context specific, I guess. But it seems to me that kind of approach, where you proactively manage arrears, and in addition to that, you try to tie it up with financial inclusion, measures, as well as, if you're a local authority, a number of them are obviously trying to promote employability measures and things of that kind to help people into the labour market. It's not as if they're opposed to that, they're trying to make these things happen too.
Yes, I mean, many of these things they would want to do anyway.
Yes.
Can you just finally, it is such a varied picture across the country. I'm just trying to work out whether or not the answer lies at a national level, at a Scottish-wide level, or whether actually we should be focusing more on local-based solutions. In other words, should we be trying to come up with a policy that will be able to apply across the board, across every local authority, or should we allow our local authorities, in rural areas or in areas of high social housing, whatever, to drop different strategies and resource those accordingly?
I think this is the classic dilemma that housing policy and social security policy face. Housing is an inherently local thing. We've always had a national social security framework. Housing policy is increasingly dependent on social security to pay back its private loans if you're a housing association, to meet the poverty needs of low-income tenants, etc. There's a real dilemma there. You want to target resources where housing need is, but it's inherently funded by a national policy. I think I'd be really worried about dismantling that sort of national aspect of that. So I think you need to do both, unfortunately.
Annabelle.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, Professor Gibb. I had a question dealing with wider issues. In the way that the committee has in past months looked at, in terms of what I would argue would be more social engineering aspects of this policy, for example, in terms of scenarios where a non-resident father is seeking a residence order and there isn't sufficient accommodation. So that has a clear impact on family law in Scotland. In terms of, for example, the blithe encouragement to take in lodgers on the part of widows who presumably have a right to a private life. But in terms of wider housing policy, I just wonder what thoughts you may have on the current appeals that are going through on minimum size of bedroom criteria and the impacts that potentially could have on wider housing policy in Scotland, because presumably there would be. Everything has a cause and effect, and there would be impacts, including vis-à-vis the balance sheets, the books of housing associations, and therefore their ability to go forth and borrow and whatever. So perhaps you could comment on that.
That's exactly right. That's exactly what I was going to say, that there certainly are concerns that, well, if you change your bedroom definitions, you're only doing it for one reason, which is to reduce the number of bedrooms that are available. So that has rental implications. It reduces the rental income you can generate. That takes us back to how flat or otherwise rent structures actually are, for the rental impact that it has on the properties. But it has also been suggested that for housing associations in particular, that private funders would take a dim view on that, because they would view that as basically a change in the covenant that they have, that the terms of the loans that they have are for one set of stock of property and one kind of security, I suppose, and that would be changed by that, and it would affect the rental income that would be generated. So it may lead to a kind of refinancing issue, and in the recent climate, refinancing doesn't really work to housing associations' favour. So there are dilemmas. But I'm sure landlords are very aware of that dilemma, and they wouldn't enter into these things without considering with their lenders the kind of situation it might put them in. But it's something that the regulator would probably have a view about as well.
No, I find that very interesting, because of course it's as I understand it, the first tier tribunal decisions are being appealed in the cases in Fife, for example, by the DWP. But I think that Fife Council was seeking perhaps to challenge the appeal going ahead. I'm not entirely sure that was at the end of October, where we are at the beginning of November with that. But presumably, I mean, trying to look at the wider policy issues, and going back to your comments about how you would measure success or otherwise of this policy from the UK government, if it is the case that in subsequent jurisprudence before the courts that changes can be made to the definition of what constitutes a bedroom and that then could start to have impacts down the line, which could lead to funding impacts for housing associations, which could then lead to the ability to be creating one-bedroom houses, and so it goes round and round. And presumably that element would need to be factored in when one is making an assessment of the success or otherwise of this policy as a sustainable measure of housing policy.
It's unintended consequences, isn't it? It's the things that flow from a policy that aren't really thought through, and we don't really know yet as to how this will play out. Probably the most likely impact is that rents would have to increase at some point in order to try and compensate. You might be putting some properties into smaller size categories, but if you've got to protect your rental income overall, you're going to have to increase the average rent to try and compensate that as far as you're able to.
Thank you very much.
I was going to go on just a little from that, and the thought did cross my mind that if we're going to see bedrooms all over Scotland redefined as cupboards as a result of legal action, might actually increase the number of one-bedroom properties we had, to our surprise. But what I wanted to ask you is, when we get a legal precedent set and a decision is made, if it turns out that these legal decisions stand, how big an impact will that have on the social housing sector in Scotland?
Well, the short answer is I don't know. I mean, I think the key thing is really what's the potential scale of the replication of that kind of decision elsewhere, and I simply don't know.
Can I clarify that slightly or redefine it slightly? If a legal precedent is set, does that mean that we'll see local authorities and housing associations all over Scotland in simply having to redefine the size of some of their properties in a wholesale sense?
Again, I suspect, I mean, I'm speculating, I guess it will depend on the position that individual landlords find themselves in, with the nature of the stock that they've got, the kinds of way that they are already dealing with under occupation, etc. As they go forward. It may not be relevant to everyone. I'm guessing. I'm not a lawyer. I wouldn't, I don't know.
So it's another variable that we'll have to factor in. Yeah, thank you.
See any other questions, Professor Gibb? Ken, you want to give
one? It's just on the issue of the impact on single people and the ill. Is there any particular work that's being done to look at the impact of what's happening and to measure the effect of this policy? This is a particularly vulnerable group, and maybe some single people will move back home. I don't know what will be happening, but the ill, everyone has to worry about the impact of such a major policy on a vulnerable group like that, and the effect on their health, on their welfare, and on their behaviours.
There was a study by McCafferty that I quoted in the report, which I must admit I didn't look at it in detail, but it was certainly that's what its focus was on. And I think the fact that such a large proportion of working age social tenants do have a disabled or ill or long-term ill member of their households suggests that this is a critical issue, and one that clearly needs much more work to be done.
Again, thanks very much, Professor Gibb. That's been really helpful, and not only allowing us to explore the findings that you've had so far, but to give us food for thought as we look ahead to what requires to continue to be done as we monitor the implications of this legislation as it's coming forward. And obviously some of these variables that have been discussed this morning, had they been taken into consideration before this draconian legislation was introduced in the first place, we might not be sitting here talking about them. Okay, but we'll look forward to looking at these in future. Okay, thanks very much. Okay, I'll suspend the meeting for 5 minutes or so before we go into our second item, which we have already agreed will be taken in private. So I'll close the public part of the meeting now. Okay, bye.